My honor today to introduce Dr. Emile Nakhleh. He's a retired CIA Senior Intelligence Service Officer and founding director of CIA's Political Islam Strategic Analysis Program Office. He currently serves as research professor and director of the Global and National Security Policy Institute at the University of New Mexico. He's a National Intelligence Council Associate and a member of the Council on Foreign Affairs. Since retiring from the US government in 2006, he has consulted on national security issues, particularly Islamic radicalization, terrorism, and the Arab states of the Middle East. He has published frequently on the Arab Spring in the Financial Times and Cipher Brief. He holds a PhD from the American University, Washington, D.C. in International Relations, an MA from Georgetown University in Political Science, and a BA from St. John's University, Minnesota in Political Science. He's the author of numerous academic books and scholarly articles. He is currently president of the World Affairs Council Albuquerque, and he and his wife, Ilonka, live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nakhleh back to the Santa Fe World Affairs Forum for this timely presentation. Welcome, Emile.
Thank you, Felicia, and thank you, Pat, for having me. It's my pleasure to reconnect with the forum and discuss current issues. So for those who are present here today, I'm going to give a short presentation of about half an hour, 35 minutes or so, and I will focus on very few questions that Pat sent to me, and to basically give an idea of what has happened to the Taliban, who is the Taliban, how their ideological underpinnings, and so on. Some of that might be elementary to some of you, but I thought it would be useful to present a complete context of what we have today in Afghanistan. So you see these 6 questions, and the slides that will follow basically address each one of these questions. Now, we are now 6 months since the rapid withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. And let's take a look at the Taliban. As I said, who are they? How did they come to power? What ideology, religious ideology, political ideology they adhere to? The specter of terrorism in Afghanistan and beyond. And I concluded with 2 slides. One I call myths and bubbles and uncertainties about Afghanistan, and then the way forward. So who are the Taliban and how they came to power? You can see from the slide, they are basically Pashtun, Dari speakers, largest and best organized of many tribal groupings in Afghanistan. They initially emerged and were formed really by the Pakistani ISI, which is the Inter-Services Intelligence, on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. They were in refugee camps in Pakistan. So Taliban is a plural of Talib, which is a student. So they were in these madrasas, Quranic schools, and that's where they, ISI began to work with them. And after, of course, the Soviet invasion and the withdrawal of the Soviets from Afghanistan, then they moved more and more into Afghanistan and began to try to form a government. And of course, there was civil war and different factions within Afghanistan. Then there was a rise, of course, of Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, but at that time, Osama bin Laden was not in in Afghanistan. He was still in Sudan, and he basically ended up in Afghanistan and Pakistan after 9/11. So under Mullah Omar, the first ruler of the Taliban ruler in Afghanistan, I visited, by the way, his house after we took over in Kandahar, and he formed that alliance for interest purposes, joint interest with Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And of course, the Taliban brought in their jihadist experience fighting the Soviets, and also the so-called Arab Mujahideen, who also participated in the fight against the Soviets, then joined forces, and Al-Qaeda began to develop training camps to train potential terrorists and recruits in Afghanistan. So, of course, we consider that type of jihad, terrorist jihad. They've always, excuse me, viewed it as liberation of their country from foreign occupation. Years back, it was the British, then the Soviets, and then the Americans. Now, how did they come to power? Well, their conquest of parts of Afghanistan was gradual. In fact, when we were still there, by the time we left Afghanistan in August of last year, they already had most of the country under their control. And in fact, throughout Afghanistan, many of the villages didn't really have any connection with the national government, federal government in Kabul. I always cite a little story. I went to Afghanistan 2 years after we defeated the Taliban. So it was like September 2003. And I went to some villages outside Kandahar in the south. And I was talking to some people, and they invited me to have some tea or something. And some did not even know, that was 2 years later, did not know that the Taliban no longer rules the country. And so you see this disconnect. So they already had most of Afghanistan. The US rapid withdrawal, of course, hastened the fall of Kabul, and that was the only thing that they needed to get was Kabul, and they got it without a shot being fired. So this is how they came to power. Now, what we need to know, I think, is what ideological, because that concerns us. I mean, what ideological foundations, what are their ideological underpinnings? So basically, we are familiar, I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the radical, intolerant, rigid, Wahhabi, Salafi ideology that emanated from Saudi Arabia, and that exists in Saudi Arabia. Well, we see part of that ideology drives the Afghanistan, but then you add to that the intolerant, rigid interpretation of the Hanafi, Deobandi Islamic jurisprudence. The Deobandi Islam is basically South Asian. That is, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. The largest Deobandi university in the world is outside New Delhi in India. And I visited that place and spent a week there going to their classes and see what they teach, of course. And that became more and more radicalized, some segments of it, and that radicalization was adopted by the Taliban. So in a sense, even though initially they belong to the Hanafi school rather than the Hanbali school of jurisprudence that exists in Saudi Arabia. Their rigid interpretation, intolerant interpretation of Hanafi Diyubandi really is not much different from the radical Wahhabi interpretation of Islam in Saudi Arabia. So that's why I said it's much like the Hanbali Wahhabi ideology. It's much like the today's Taliban. Is really not much different, in my view, than the ideology that drove Mullah Omar in the 90s. And the Taliban, of course, ruled Afghanistan from 96 until 01, until 9/11. And after they were defeated by the Americans after 9/11. So they are much the same rule. They go by Sharia law, but not mainstream Sharia law, but a radical interpretation of Sharia law. That is, they don't believe in Western style democracy. They believe in what they call the divine rule or hukum. This is also the basis, of course, of the Wahhabi Salafi Islam, that man-made rule is not really good, and it's artificial. So their interpretation of a quote-unquote democracy is Sharia law. And under that type of interpretation, I'm sorry to say that women's rights and social behavior are extremely restricted according to this interpretation. Non-Sunni minorities, including Shia minority, which is a Muslim faction, a faction of Islam that is adhered to by 10 to 15% of the 1.7 billion Muslims worldwide, that is viewed by this interpretation, that is the Taliban, the Wahhabi interpretation, as non-Muslim. So they tend to attack Shia mosques and houses of prayers, and of course other minorities as well. And so to continue with the ideological underpinnings, now you might hear, well, now that they are in government, well, they probably will moderate, which is kind of a logical or rational statement to make. But in reality, there is not much, I call it ideological daylight between the Taliban government and terrorist groups that existed before and exist now. And the examples in that are the people who are now in the government. So you see the Amir al-Mu'mineen, or commander of the faithful, Haibatullah Akhundzada, is already made statements that he's intent on reviving Islamic Sharia policies of Mullah Omar. In fact, in his government, other members of the ruling council, one is Mullah Muhammad Yaqub, and Yaqub is the son of Mullah Omar. Another very important person of the Taliban government, in charge even of the security ministry and security police, is Sirajuddin Haqqani. Haqqani is the son of the founder of the violent Haqqani group. And the Haqqani group continues to exist in Afghanistan. You find another member is Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, who is the co-founder of the Taliban and who was a negotiator in Doha, Qatar. So I just want, there are others, of course, but these are examples of people in the government, powerful people in the government. And I find it very difficult to believe that these people who belong to these groups before are now going to become moderate legislators or leaders in the new regime. So I just wanted to do that. And then we still have terrorist groups in Afghanistan today. Al-Qaeda, still some factions of it exist in Afghanistan. ISIS still exists in Afghanistan. ISIS-K, or the Islamic State of Khorasan, a province. Khorasan is an old name in Islam for that part of the Islamic world, or it's called ISKP. Both, by the way, both Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and ISIS are against ISIS-K because of its brutality and bloody approach. In fact, most of the recent attacks against Shia mosques have been waged by ISIS-K. Then the Haqqani network is still there, and you have the Haqqani, who is the son of the founder, is a member of the government. And so how is he going to tell his group, his network, well, no, I am now a member of the government, so we have to cool it off a bit, right? The smaller groups still exist. They are smaller, but each in its own way can conduct bloody actions. And TTP, Taliban, Pakistan, is known as the Pakistani Taliban. It started in the Fatah region and still mostly strong there. The IMU, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, has operated in Afghanistan because it's too dangerous for them to operate in Uzbekistan. Some of them still operate in the Fergana Valley in Uzbekistan, but they operate out of Afghanistan. And a team, which is the Eastern Turkestan Islamic Movement, which is known for the Uyghurs, right? They basically have argued for independence or autonomy of the Uyghur region, which is in Xinjiang province, where the Muslim minority, which is a large minority of Chinese, live. And so, in a sense, before I move on, just the bottom line judgment of that discussion is that so far we have not seen real indications from the Taliban in the past 6 months, that they have moved away either from the ideological foundation of terrorist organizations, or that they have really restricted the activities of groups like ISIS-K or ISIS or Al-Qaeda or especially the Haqqani network. Now, there was the other question that Taliban regional and international support. Well, you know, Pakistan has been a major supporter of the Taliban. They created the Taliban. And I've always felt that we've always made 2 major mistakes about Pakistan, really. And that's my judgment based on all the analysis and research I've done. One is that we've always overestimated Pakistan's support of our CT policies, that is counterterrorism policies. I missed CT, I think, here. And underestimated Pakistan's obsession with India. I mean, Pakistan has always talked the talk to us, but in reality, their focus has always been on India. China has indicated support for the Taliban, despite its cultural, genocide, this is misspelled here, a campaign against China's Sunni Muslim Uyghur population in Xinjiang. And the second element for China's support is this RBI, the Road and Belt Initiative, that China has used to expand its economic, political influence throughout the world, and not just in South Asia, but in Africa, in Central Asia, and the Balkans, and so on. So it's a global part of China's global reach, if you will, this RBI. The Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, to some degree, support in one way or the other, support the Taliban regime. India to some degree because of Pakistan, and also Iran to some degree because the eastern part of Afghanistan, especially Herat, is the gateway to commerce between Afghanistan and Iran. Now, I want to come to a different question. I call them myths, bubbles, and uncertainties surrounding the U.S. 20-year presence and rapid withdrawal. I will begin with the last bullet here, and that is that the decision to withdraw, that is my view, was good. It was the right decision to withdraw. Some disagree with that, but the execution of the withdrawal was wanting. It was not done right. It required more troops there, but the reality is that rapid withdrawal and the chaotic withdrawal basically opened Kabul's gates to the Taliban, literally without firing a shot. Now, I use the word myths and bubbles. That's basically concerning Kabul. First, the uncertainty. You know, when we went to Afghanistan in 2001, the mission was clear. I was in the government then. To some degree, was involved in some of those activities. The mission was clear. We had to defeat the Taliban because they hosted Al-Qaeda. We had to defeat Al-Qaeda because bin Laden told us very clearly that they were the one who conducted the attack, the 9/11 attacks on the homeland. It was the first of its kind, the first terrorist act of its kind, and the United States saw no option but to go after. The uncertainty and the mission creep developed a bit later, after we defeated the Taliban, after Al-Qaeda fled from Afghanistan. And then, I think then and today, I wasn't clear then, and I'm not clear today, excuse me, as to why we continued in Afghanistan. And every time we raise questions to policymakers, are we there to build that nation? Well, no, nation building was not there. Are we there to create a new form of democracy? Well, it wasn't really that as much. But regardless of whether the answers were qualified answers, were unclear answers, we proceeded with what I would call mission creep in Afghanistan. And we focused our efforts primarily on Kabul, to some degree on Kandahar as well, but primarily on Kabul. And we began to create a whole new class of Afghans in Kabul, educated, free thinkers, women activists, educated women, schools, universities, businesses. Was a very lively environment. we really created a class of Afghans that we could point to and say, well, to the doubters, if you will, this is what we have done in Afghanistan. The myth, in my view, is that we began to believe that this bubble that we created over Kabul led us to think, mistakenly, in my view, that that represented Afghanistan. In reality, it did not represent Afghanistan. That class that we created wanted us to stay. The reality, most of Afghanistan did not want us to stay. The reality is that we created, excuse me, a class of highly educated women, free-thinking women in the arts, in medicine, in all kinds of fields, in businesses, in all kinds of fields. But that class of women did not represent the women of Afghanistan, even though we had all kinds of activities and NGOs and charitable foundations and operations outside Kabul. But the government that we created in Kabul, the social classes that we created in Kabul really did not represent Afghanistan. And that's why I say I use the word myth and bubble. Now, of course, we discovered that nation building has its own perils, but we always said we were not there to do nation building. And another myth about training the Afghan armed forces. I know these are a bit harsh statements, but I think they are real statements. That is, that we trained the Afghan army, and without us, the Afghan army could not fight. But you know, when you go back in the last 2-3 years, 2 years in particular, before Kabul fell and before Afghanistan fell, and whatever battles that the Afghan army primarily fought and won, they did not do that without our air support, intelligence support, and logistical support. Now, if that is true, then why did we convince ourselves, or some of our military leaders convince themselves, that we are creating an independent army in Afghanistan that is capable of fighting on its own? The fact is, they are not capable of fighting on its own. Neither the government nor the army, and that's why they disbanded so quickly once the Taliban took over. So, I mean, I think if we are going to learn any lessons from Afghanistan, probably it is this, that, you know, we can go into our country and situate ourselves in the capital and create a mission for us, one of the largest embassies in the world practically, and say, well, this is Afghanistan. It's not. And the same thing with, hopefully we can draw lessons for future engagements in other countries from this. Now, okay, so they are in power, and the way forward. Well, of course, there are challenges and opportunities. There are challenges for the Taliban, there are challenges for the regional states, and there are challenges for international actors, including the United States, our own country. The Taliban, I don't need to tell you, the economic conditions in Afghanistan are really terrible. And so poverty and hunger are real. The threat to the population in Afghanistan from poor economic conditions and lack of food, the threat is real. And so that is a major challenge. The second major challenge for the Taliban is the presence of terrorist groups within the country. Now they say, okay, we are not going to allow that. They are not going to allow these terrorist groups to export their terrorism. First, that's a nice statement, right? But I don't know whether they can control it. Can they control their borders? I don't think they can. They don't have the enough military and other border patrol forces to patrol the border. So they can. The regional challenge for regional powers are their neighbors first. Iran, Pakistan, India. How are they going to deal, and also the Gulf Arab states, how are they going to deal with the Taliban if they continue to have a government consisting of strong members of terrorist organizations? And are they going to recognize the Taliban regime, establish relations? What about the rights of women, the rights of minorities, the rights of other groups in Afghanistan that are being threatened by the regime? And of course, for us, in terms of as an actor that is very much interested in what's happening in Afghanistan, we have to make certain important decisions. Recently, the president issued an executive order taking half of the money, what is it, $6 or $7 billion that belong to Afghanistan in this country. And they said that half of them would go to some of the families that suffered from 9/11, and the other half would go to Afghanistan for economic purposes. So there are some opportunities there because the Taliban are in a very bad economic situation. There are opportunities that we can work with them. So I said engaging the Taliban really, even though we engage the Taliban and other regional states might engage the Taliban and even recognize him, we really have limited influence regarding the protecting the rights of women and other minorities that were gained, as I said, in recent years. The path to democracy. I don't think the Taliban will resurrect even the regime that existed before, corrupt as it was. Then ultimately the US and I'm afraid together with regional allies will have to pursue diplomatic engagement with the Taliban. Why? Because first, it's in power, and two, we need to save that country from collapse, and therefore from chaos, regional chaos and instability. And we need to really save the Afghan people from starvation. So this balance between national interest and humanitarian interest, this balance has got to be struck. And I don't think effectively we can strike this balance without ultimately recognizing the Taliban, much as we dislike and disagree with their ideology. I will probably stop here and open the floor to questions.